Hello. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Positive Links speaker series session, Organizational Compassion, a Relational Approach, presented by the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan. I'm Monica Warline, Faculty Director of the Center, and I'm thrilled to welcome you on behalf of everyone at the Center. A few notes about our technology today. We are using webinar mode, so we can't see you or hear you, but you do have access to the Q&A feature in your toolbar. And we also have the transcription feature available that you can toggle on or off using the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. I would like to thank our sponsors who help us present today's speaker, the Sanger Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, and the Zell-Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies. They all help us bring this speaker series to you, and we have promotional partners who help us get the word out. We're very grateful to Ann Arbor Spark, to the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management, and the Organizational Development and Change Division of the Academy of Management, who help us invite new people to see our speaker series. Here at the Center for Positive Organizations, we've been reimagining a co-learning community that brings people together across boundaries of generations, disciplines, industries, sectors, and roles, where everyone gets to learn from every chair. We would invite you to join us if that sounds intriguing to you and you love this field. Members of our community get to join several of our Positive Links speakers like Ace for a private Ask Me Anything session. So please consider checking out our co-learning community. And finally, we love bringing you these Positive Links series to share inspiring science-backed strategies for helping your organization thrive. We would love your support if you love these as well. All support is gratefully accepted. So I want to introduce someone I'm lucky to call a colleague today. And I think hopefully fair to say even a friend. Ace Simpson is a compassion scholar. He served on the faculties at the UTS Business School in Sydney and more recently Brunel Business School in London. His research is situated broadly within the frame of positive organizational scholarship, but also more specifically, expertise on compassion in organizations, which he'll talk about with us today. Ace has used compassion as a lens for challenging organizational issues such as discrimination, bullying, and disengagement. He's been collaborating with organizations working on these issues, including the National Health Service in the UK, to enhance compassion capability. And he is the co-author of a textbook entitled Positive Organizational Behavior, in addition to the new book that he will talk about some today, this textbook on organizational compassion. Ace, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Monica, for that kind invitation. And indeed, we are friends. And so, yeah, colleagues and friends. Thank you so much. A warm welcome.
Yes. Well, we almost never get the opportunity to just talk shop about compassion. So this will be fun and delightful. Could you start us off, Ace, by saying, you in the subtitle of the book call on compassion as a relational process. Could you tell us what you mean by compassion and why you emphasize relational process?
Great question. Some years ago, I was invited to a symposium at Sydney University Business School, and I was excited to be presenting there as well. But one thing that quickly astonished me was that most of the presentations spoke about compassion within the healthcare context where a lot of colleagues there had been doing research, but it was self-compassion. And self-compassion is very important. Teaching self-compassion to healthcare workers is critical. It reduces their stress and anxiety and self-doubt and improves their patient care outcomes as well. But it's important to also distinguish this is inward facing, dealing with our own concerns, recognizing those, noticing those fears and anxieties, and then offering support to oneself through that acknowledgement and working through it. When we talk about organizational compassion, our emphasis is on the other. So we define compassion in organizations as noticing, empathizing with, seeking to understand or appraise and respond to the suffering of others. And so there's this emphasis on giving compassion to another. Even that definition has problems, as we've discussed together many times. It's the giver's perspective, the giver
Yeah.
who notices and empathizes. And where is the person receiving the compassion in that definition? And so in our book, we have sought to address that by broadening perspectives. And when we ask questions about that, the role of the receiver in the compassion process, and give them voice, so to speak, and seek to really understand how they're signaling their
Yeah.
need for support, and how that actually triggers a compassion process. And it's their emoting about their fears and concerns and angst that needs to be empathized with.
Yeah.
And it's their narrating or describing their struggles, or being invited to describe their struggles, that the compassion giver is, provides that platform for them to describe what's going on, and then their needs, rather than just assuming that we know what's best for another and how to provide support. Really inviting the compassion receiver, the person who struggles, who's challenged, who's suffering, to explain what they desire and what they need to address their concern. So really broadening our understanding of compassion and really thinking about it in these terms of a relational exchange.
Yeah. It's fascinating your experience that all of the presentations were focused on self-compassion. I imagine that the rigidity and inflexibility of certain kinds of systems, healthcare certainly one, um, undermines our sense of possibility for change across the whole system. And so the turn towards self compassion is a bit of a self protective turn in a way to try to resource people individually. But we know that compassion really matters for entire
Right.
systems. So, what
Yeah.
does the research tell us about why we should care about organizational compassion?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a good place to start, self-compassion, and that organizations provide at least that training or support in terms of bringing awareness to their employees, caregivers, of the importance of self-compassion. But it's also, in Australia, we would say it's a cop-out, in the sense that if an organization's putting all the burden of their being overworked and stressed and anxious and burnout, puts it all onto the caregiver or the employee, without actually taking responsibility for changing the organization itself. And so, as organizational scholars, those are the areas of interest for us. What are the organizational processes that are key to providing an environment where compassion relations can flourish and thrive? And our research shows that when compassion is supported, and when people are able to express care and support for one another, or receive that from their supervisors, from their mentors, when they see it in their leaders, They feel a greater sense of loyalty, commitment, trust. They feel more inspired to give their discretionary time and energy to the organization. When they feel cared for and they see the organization cares, then they're going to care more as well for their colleagues and the organization. So there is a mutual process, a win-win there in compassion relations. And so that would be a utilitarian argument for why compassion is important for organizations. And utilitarian ethics, it has its place, aside from just being virtuous and the right thing to do to treat others with dignity. There
Yeah.
is a business case as well, that when organizations pay attention to their people and support their people with compassion, particularly in their struggles, in their times of distress, then it it comes back to the organization as well in terms of goodwill and loyalty and engagement
Yeah.
as well, and better customer outcomes, because when employees care about the organization, then that enhances the experience of customers, or in a healthcare context, of patients
Makes sense.
as
Yeah.
well.
Well, and it feels important that you name the utilitarian ethics, but also the moral argument, and that we don't shy away from making moral arguments about the need for compassion in our society. So I appreciate you calling both of those things about why this conversation about compassion matters so much.
Mhm.
And okay, Ace. Something I love about your work and appreciate about you so much is that you bring the discussion about compassion together with a discussion about power. And you really call us to reflect on the crucial role of power in organizations and what it means for compassion relations and how compassion unfolds. So, um, would you help us or just open up your thinking about how compassion and power come together and how we think about these two things in relation?
Yeah, great question. And I will start by saying that I was really fortunate when I was doing my doctoral studies to be supervised by Stuart Clegg, who is one of the leading theorists on power in organizations. And so I took the opportunity to draw on his insight and wisdom and experience to then look at compassion through that frame, or through that lens. The first thing to say about power is most people think it's about titles and positions. And the way we think about power in sociology and organizational studies is as relational dynamics. All relationships take place within a context of power relations, and compassion is no different. When we talk about the giver and the receiver of compassion, there are power dynamics that come into sharp focus. And these considerations can really also pose as barriers to compassion when we look at legitimacy, or when we consider, so power concerns also the distribution of resources and what matters, whose voice counts, whose concerns are important. Let me give you an example. Some of my research was in Queensland in 2011. There was a flood, and there was an incident where a woman was trapped in floodwaters in her car, and she called the Australian equivalent of 911 for help.
Mhm.
And she was reprimanded for driving in floodwater. She ended up drowning. And so there was a royal inquiry
Mm,
into that. And it was really interesting following the public commentary on this. People were actually split in terms of who to blame, whether it was her for driving in floodwater and being a legitimate receiver of their empathy and compassion, or the emergency responder whose
mm,
time can be precious for other callers and so on. And so we have rules actually in society about who is a legitimate receiver of
yeah,
compassion. And
right.
generally, if you haven't caused the suffering to yourself, if it's beyond your personal ability to address, beyond your control, if it's unexpected, the suffering is unexpected, and you haven't ignored warnings. In the case of this woman, she was reprimanded because there had been so many warnings about driving in floodwater. And so people, including the 911 responder, blamed her for ignoring those warnings. And then there are the deeper systemic issues that can also just undermine a person's ability to address their own situation, their own suffering. So we have rules around implicit, non-stated rules around who is a legitimate recipient of compassion. Similarly, with the compassion giver, if somebody comes and offers us support, try to give someone $100 on the street, a lot of people will refuse it because they want to know, what's behind it. Why are
Yeah,
you giving me
yeah,
this $100? What are
right.
you going to get out of it? How is this self-serving, or is it entirely altruistic? So these types of concerns, they relate to power dynamics. And part of our model of the compassion process is the appraisal, or trying to
Mm,
understand the
mm,
situation of the receiver, but also of the giver as
yeah,
well.
sure. So the power is coloring you're giving us a whole process unfolding between people or between many people. And the power in suffuses through the whole process.
Yeah, and then organizationally, we have the allocation or distribution of resources and what is a valid concern, or what is a valid um, need to address with the distribution of resourcing. So, for example, let's think about the pandemic, when suffering became a lot more obvious
Mm,
in compassion work.
yeah,
You often say it, other compassion scholars say, after Peter Frost, there's always suffering in the room. But
right.
sometimes a situation like a pandemic make it obvious. And so organizations are called, or they are held more accountable for how they address that suffering in those times.
Yeah.
But some do better than others. So, for example, Hilton hotels, we might not
Hmm.
necessarily think of them as an example of compassion, but during the pandemic, they had to lay off lots of employees. People aren't traveling, they're not booking hotels during the lockdown. But then rather than just laying off their employees, they put in a lot of effort to find alternative roles or employment for their people in grocery delivery, or
Mm,
other areas
mm,
where work had become prominent. They partnered with Amex to provide accommodation for healthcare workers who couldn't go home for fear of um, bringing harm to their family members.
yeah.
And so this distribution of resources or choices concerning what matters and what is important, that relates to power as well. And so, yeah, power dynamics shape compassion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to turn to a question that's popped up in the Q&A from our audience for a moment, because I think it touches on this issue of power, and it may help us disentangle a couple of important conceptual puzzles.
Okay.
So Tamaras is asking us to talk about um, what do you mean by compassion and power in relation to an organization's mission or output or corporate social responsibility. So, what does what do you have to say about compassion in relation to organizations that may do damage to the environment? What's their compassionate responsibility? Or I know your important work about mission-driven organizations that inadvertently or advertently create harm as they pursue what looks like a compassionate mission. And then Tam was sort of asking you to disentangle, like, is that organizational compassion, or is organizational compassion what she calls just good management or good leadership that extends care to employees? Or is it both of those things and the power manifests differently?
Yeah, great question. And the thing about when we bring a power lens to look at compassion, it just brings in a lot of the complexity. So it goes from being something very simple and possibly straightforward. Compassion is complex, but when we bring in the power dynamic, it just adds in a lot of complexity there. And that's important because it helps us to be just a little less naive
Yeah.
around compassion and to recognize that there may be different motivations behind it, some of them benign, some of them about control, some of them about recognition. So actually taking power in society. It also helps us to recognize that even with good intentions, there might be negative outcomes.
Mhm.
We may
Yeah.
want to do good, but if we don't properly understand the needs of the receiver and really try to understand from their perspective, their situation and their needs, then our care might actually create further suffering down the line.
Yes.
It might also be that something that appears to be compassionate at one point in time, when we look at it retrospectively, we say, okay, the intention was good, but in hindsight, I should have actually taken a stronger stance. So
Yeah. Right.
these things are not easy to disentangle. They're not easy to resolve. And I don't think they're meant to be resolved once and for all.
Yes.
They are to bring our attention to the need for ongoing self-reflection, but also dialogue, a communicative process with all parties, with ourselves, but also with others,
Mm,
compassion givers,
right.
receivers, organization more broadly, what its mission is, and to constantly reassess and reevaluate where we are in terms of our compassion mission and how we're better supporting, how we support the community around us, our employees, our other stakeholders, the community more broadly.
Thank you.
So
It
yeah, I
does
don't know that we did
adding
disentangle, but
Yeah, well, or
clarify.
re-entangle or further entangle, it's okay. But I think that adding the discussion of power is important because it acknowledges the reality of organizations. It increases the complexity of our discussion about something like compassion. And it's important to challenge the overly simplistic assumptions that we might make, or the naive view that compassion is obvious. And so if we just seek to be compassionate, good things will happen. I think that it's really important to add nuance and complexity when we're talking about addressing suffering prospectively and in response, as you say in the book, to really complex um, social difficulties, financial difficulties, and ways that all kinds of ways that people suffer. So when you bring power into the equation, of course, I know that you also um, talk a lot about how leaders can think about using their role and the power that may or may not be associated with that role to foster greater compassion. So, can you talk a little bit about what specific things you see leaders doing to facilitate compassion across an organization?
Yeah, so leaders, they do play a pivotal role in fostering compassion within their organizations. First and foremost, I would say by just giving permission to others to be compassionate. We say that suffering is always in the room, but we could also say there's always compassion as well in any social situation, social dynamic. There will be micro acts of kindness. And so organizations are no different. Day to day, people cover for each other, they provide slack for one another, they support one another in different ways, emotionally, but also practically as well. And this facilitates just day to day organizational functioning. Although it's not taught necessarily in business schools, it's not acknowledged in management and organizational studies or theory. But really, we might say even that organizations couldn't function without those micro practices of care and compassion day to day. Leaders, they can highlight that it's there. They can acknowledge
Mhm.
it, they can recognize it, they can encourage it, they can facilitate it, they can demonstrate that this is really important and matters within our organization. A great example of a leader who really emphasized compassion within his organization was Jeff Weiner, the former CEO of LinkedIn. He
Yeah.
would talk about managing compassionately.
Mhm.
He would talk about how he's applied this in his own leadership by pausing before reacting, understanding others' hopes and fears, and trying to foster their well-being and success. So that's him personally. That's the first thing that a leader can do. They can role model compassion for others, other leaders within their organizations. They can take that further by seeking to foster it within organizational processes. Jeff Weiner taught workshops on managing compassionately. He organized programs for the employees across the organization. They
Mhm.
organized compassionate leadership or compassion in leadership summits as well, and more broadly sought to integrate it into other organizational processes. And so leaders, they if their compassion doesn't have support of leadership, it'll be there, but it will be kind of underground, so to
Mhm.
speak. When
Mm.
it is supported by leadership, then it can really flourish and thrive.
So if often it's the case that we'll hear stories of people that aren't in leadership positions or aren't in positions of executive influence. Um, and they will want to know, what might I do, or how could I work to create a more compassionate organization, without having the support of leadership or without occupying such a role. So, um, how how do you think about that bottom up, or if people aren't seeing the compassionate leadership around them that they wish for, what then?
Yeah, great question. And what comes to mind as you're asking the question is Peter Frost's toxin handlers. That's just one expression of that, where a compassionate leader or supervisor lower down the organizational hierarchy becomes a defender of their team or of their people, defending them against the unreasonable deadlines and defending them or protecting them from
Okay.
demands that come from headquarters that really undermine the well-being and psychological, safety and security of their employees. So I guess that would be an extreme case because Frost's toxin handlers, they take a personal hit from that and undermines their own physical health and well-being as they shield their people from toxicity that comes higher up in the
Yeah,
organization.
right.
at a more
And
positive level,
yeah, well, I was just going to say, hence the need for the self-compassion layer
right? Yeah,
too,
yeah,
right?
that's
That
great. Yeah,
Peter was writing that book before the word self-compassion was popularized and before we
yeah,
had all these ways of thinking about it. So um, it's uh, it's an interesting thing to bring the two together.
right. Yes, it is. And yeah, so aside from that, the manager or team leader lower down in the organization, they can try to bring these practices, seeing their division as a micro or smaller organization within the organization. So similar ideas to what we teach about the role of the organizational context and the different levers that we have for creating compassionate processes. As much as possible, they could be integrated within a division, within an organization. I've definitely seen that working with healthcare organizations and other organizations. When we look at the data from our surveys, we'll find some divisions they rate very highly, and the
Hmm.
employees are
Yeah.
rating their division very highly in terms of compassion, and others, um, it's not the case. And so it's exactly the same organization. Specifically, when you're dealing with a very large organization like a healthcare district, as an example, you can find these disparities within the same organization, indicating that it is possible for a leader to create a microculture
Mm, yes.
within, yeah, within their team division.
Well, since you've worked with such large organizations on trying to build compassion capability, and we like to think and talk a lot about what in the organization and its context helps do that or hinders that.
Yeah,
Would you highlight some organizational features that either really get in the way and inhibit compassion across the system, or that you want to highlight as enablers that matter?
yeah. It's such an important consideration for us as organizational scholars to really pay attention to these different aspects or elements of the organization that either facilitate or inhibit compassion. Excuse me. And just to frame the context, um, before I go into discussing those levers, I would like to give just another example in healthcare where the what attracts people to that profession, to be a doctor, to be a nurse. Often it's a concern, a desire to help others. There's a compassion there. These are the caring professions. They are compassionate professions. And the surprising thing is that healthcare organizations around the world that recruit these caring people, compassionate people, they are overrepresented in terms of bullying
Mm,
and harassment.
mm,
And that's a real puzzle. That's a real surprise.
mm,
There have been cases in the UK where patients were neglected, like scandals that brought on royal inquiries. And what the findings were, that there was a lack of compassion within the organization, that the processes were too much concerned with efficiency
mm,
and effectiveness, and there was under resourcing, and this was all putting a lot of pressure on people, and it was creating stress and anxiety and burnout, and that was undermining relationships to the extent that they end up bullying one another, taking out their frustrations on one another. And so paying attention then to the factors within an organization that can make a difference is of critical importance. And I know you're asking me the question, but you've also written extensively on this. including your wonderful book with Jane Dutton on workplace compassion. But it's the culture of the organization, culture meaning what the espoused values are, what even the artifacts and then the more superficial aspects of the organization. So culture is really important. Culture can normalize compassion or not.
Mhm.
And when it does, then it can create an environment where people feel more safe to address mistakes and concerns and communicate with one another and be vulnerable and reach out and support one another. The other that we have discussed already is leadership. So
Yeah.
leadership plays a critical role in role modeling, but also ensuring that compassion is integrated within the
Mm.
processes of the organization.
Mhm.
There are the routines of the organization. Who does it hire? What does it value in terms of performance? Is it a metric of productivity, or is there also a relational dynamic to
Mhm.
evaluation in terms of performance? Maybe you have a top sales agent who, but who achieves those sales by
Yeah.
squashing out other team members or trampling on other team members. So our routines
Mhm.
and um, our daily rituals, our check-ins, our processes like that. Our communication is also important. Having open communication, empathic channels, opportunities for people to voice concerns and be heard without fear of reprisal as well. And then related to culture are mission and values. A lot of the time, organizations, they profess a certain mission and
Mhm.
values, but then there's a disconnect
Yes.
between that
Yeah.
espoused mission and value set and then the actual practices
Yeah.
of the organization. So being aligned there
Mm.
is also of vital importance.
There's an interesting observation coming from the audience about what and I would think of as a kind of practice or routine. So this is Paul who says, I was part of several very large organizations that periodically did significant cost cutting efforts, which led to layoffs. And in no case did I ever observe senior leaders expressing compassion. In fact, there was a kind of widespread thinking that compassion should be avoided in situations like this one.
Right.
And so we so um just in a moment like this where cost cutting is at the forefront of the organizational agenda, does compassion have a place?
Absolutely. Yeah. So cost cutting may be required for an organization's survival, and a leader has to make those tough choices because they need to think about the organization as a whole and all the employees and all those that are stakeholders within that organization. The leader is responsible to that whole. And so at some stage, it may require cost cutting, but that can be done in a manner that lacks compassion, or it can be done with a lot of empathy and a lot of care, where the leader does speak to employees
Yeah.
and explains why those decisions are made, explains the different choices that were available. So really being held accountable for the decisions made. Sometimes leaders, they try to lead through, a spreadsheet and just say, the data said we had to do it. But there are always choices. And there
Yeah.
are great examples of organizations like Costco or Southwest, or I gave Hilton earlier, where employees, that question comes up of, laying off employees after a global financial crisis or after, let's say, 9/11, when all air travel is grounded across the people are too afraid to fly. And so as an airline, what are you going to do? You're flying planes on different routes that, the planes are empty. So you have to take those routes. You have to diminish the number of routes you're flying, which means possibly layoffs.
Mm-hmm.
Or or the organization could go to the employees and say, we need to diminish the number of routes for now.
Right.
Things will change in time.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to ask everyone to reduce your number. So we could either lay some of you off, or we could, and what we're going to do is ask you all to work less hours and take a pay cut for the time being. We're not laying anyone off. And once things return to the way they were, we'll increase your hours and everyone will return to their level of pay. So there are choices as well that organizations can make when they have compassion as a value, as a concern.
Right.
There's, finding alternative employees or helping employees with counseling and career guidance and training them for employment in other areas as well.
Right.
There's lots of
I,
options.
yeah, I often think that when we get into moments like that where things feel at threat, that a kind of defensiveness comes to the fore. Of course, we know this from organizational theory, but also that it's easy to fall back on a legalistic approach, right?
Mhm.
And you have to bring the compassionate leadership forward, right, alongside the legal considerations and the other considerations that are being made.
Yeah.
So
Those are the moments when our values are really tested, right? The rhetoric is tested,
yes, 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 it's easier to talk about compassion in the good times, I guess,
right? Yeah,
than the times when the suffering is widening.
yeah.
Um, so take us into paradoxes. Part of what you do in your book is highlight paradoxes of compassion. What do you mean by that? And are we kind of pointing at one right now when we're talking about why compassion is easy when suffering seems distant?
Yeah, compassion is laden with paradoxes. So I publish a lot in paradox theory as well. Power and paradox, these are two lenses that I work with a lot, and they bring new insight to thinking about compassion as well. So compassion in organizations is inherently paradox laden, filled with tensions and contradictions. And these can, again, act as barriers to compassion. One relates to this tension between sentiment versus rationality. So compassion can be characterized as sentimental and therefore not relevant
Mm,
to the
yes,
organizational context.
yes,
The rational organization, where our decisions are based on facts as opposed to emotion. Compassion can also be seen as weak or a weakness,
yes,
and leadership requires strength and tough decision making. And it's what do they say? A dog eats dog world or out there, yeah. And
yes,
so compassion has no place. That kind of weakness has no place in the organization. Another tension
right,
relates to due process or fairness within an
mhm,
organization versus
mhm,
exceptionalism.
right,
When
right,
we flexibly adapt and address a unique individual's concern, a unique concern faced by an individual. And so paradox theory looks at these tensions. So these are tensions that are interdependent,
mhm,
they contradict, but they are also interdependent, and they can paralyze action. So in terms of compassion, if it's seen to be a weakness or sentiment or exceptionalism, we might decide, okay, we're not we can't act
Yeah.
compassionately. It doesn't have a
Right.
place in organizations. And that's what paradoxes do. Paradox theory says, however, that if we take a both and approach to these tensions, they create synergy that's even more powerful. And
Hmm.
so if we think about compassion as, yes, emotional and there's sentiment there, but it can also be wise and rational as well. In our theory, in our model of
Yeah.
compassion, we say noticing, empathizing, and then appraising, responding. So the sentiment and then the cognitive process are both integrated within that model. Whereas Plato, Socrates, they rejected compassion as a passion
Right.
in favor of rationality, the
Yes.
philosophy. And so it's similarly with compassion as weakness. You've written a lot about courage,
Mm-hmm.
and it really does take a lot of courage to lean in to suffering rather than turning a blind eye to it or ignoring it or saying that's not our concern, to actually face the suffering and to lean in and try to understand it and engage with it. It takes a lot of strength. It takes a lot of courage. And so, yeah, we can reframe that.
Yeah.
Compassion is strong and powerful as
Yeah.
well. And
Yeah.
compassionate leaders,
Right.
yeah, they have those characteristics.
Right.
They are sensitive, but they're also strong and
Right.
powerful. And then
Yeah.
similarly with fairness and flexibility. So when we
Right.
look at these things as mutually apparently in tension, but also mutually supportive,
Yes.
then it brings even a greater power to compassion. And then that comes
Mm-hmm.
back to the business case that we were discussing earlier.
Right.
Organizations about efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
but then and then employee well-being is messy and
Yes.
human processes. But the sociologist Habermas, he spoke about system and life world being in tension. That life world or human processes, they are soft. At a certain point, as they expand, they require organizing. They require
Mm-hmm.
systems, but then
Yeah.
systems have their own logic, and it's a logic of efficiency that then starts
Right.
to suffocate the life world.
Yes.
And so they need to work together. And again, we come back to that communicative process of maintaining open dialogue between both needs and how they
Mm-hmm.
can support rather than conflict with each other.
Mm. Yes. So in the audience Q&A, there's a question that goes at this paradox. So let's just talk a little bit more, see if we can pull out an example. So um, in healthcare, for instance, there's a need for efficiency, a strong need for efficiency, of course, and for safety, but also there's this need for humanness and for tending to suffering. So, how do leaders in healthcare or people who want to see more compassion in healthcare use this paradox to create both?
Yeah, to recognize that although they appear to be in tension, there is also a possibility where if we take a this and approach rather than this or, that we can get the best of both. So recognize the tension, but then open the dialogue to explore possibility. Yes, efficiency is important, just as important. So the efficiency is really there to support human processes of, particularly in healthcare, it's healing. So to create a healing environment, it needs to be one that's supportive and caring and compassionate, and it helps when the people around you are receiving that as well as because when you just are having to give without receiving love and care and kindness, it
Yeah.
can be draining and it leads to a compassion fatigue. And so, yeah, rather than just taking one horn of the paradox over the other, seeing how we can address the two together. And this requires oscillation between the two horns.
Yes.
Yeah, the
Yes.
two poles. We're constantly oscillating, checking in on both sides, and seeking to manage that balance.
Yeah. So there's another question that might be related to paradox a little bit that's coming from the audience that asks, how could you ensure that a compassionate leader is not manipulated or exploited?
Yeah, that comes back to our legitimacy question. So the power dynamics of compassion. The receiver or the person receiving compassionate support, they can, in principle, and this is a fear that we have of being taken advantage of.
Right.
If I'm kind, if I'm compassionate, others might take that for weakness and then manipulate me and take advantage of me. And that potential will always be there. That possibility will always be there. And so one option is to decide, okay, I'm not going to be compassionate. I'm just going to show this tough face, and I'm going to hide my compassion and say that it doesn't have a role or a place. The other is to acknowledge that, yeah, sometimes I might be taken advantage of, but I'm willing to take that risk as a leader. I'm going to acknowledge, yeah, sometimes some team members may take, sick leave or something when they're not really sick, or they might exploit the system in one way or another. But I would hope and I would expect that as I am compassionate and supportive, we build a certain level of trust as well between us. And within that context of trust and loyalty and commitment and engagement that come from a culture or an environment of compassion, and the likelihood of being taken for granted or taken advantage of would diminish as
Yeah.
well.
Yes. So there are a couple of questions coming in that we should probably address quickly here regarding our reference to toxin handlers. I think someone was asking for the title of Peter Frost's book, so we can make sure that we get the title of the book into the chat, but it's called Toxic Emotions at Work. And we're not saying, let's be clear, Ace, I believe anyway, correct me if I'm wrong. We're not saying in this dialogue that toxin handlers should just continue absorbing toxicity from the system ad nauseum and never speak up or counter the toxic environment, which is maybe a misperception that came through in our dialogue. So let's use the paradox framing to talk about how, and the courage framing to talk about how you we need people to handle suffering in
Yes.
organizations. Then
Mm.
organizations can't work without that, as you point out to us. But we don't need people to sit back and absorb toxicity and suffering as victims of poorly run or you know t- uh, um, exploitative organizations. So how do we
Yeah.
get at that?
Yeah, great. And something that my mind comes back to is, so yeah, there are different elements to this. One, we said be a toxin, the toxin handler, but the manager or leader can also take a role of fierce compassion as well. Christian Neff talks about compassion as being an open hand, but also a closed fist in that sense. Compassion can also be strength in that it involves resistance to oppression and abuse. And so that's another way that leaders can support their team within their organization that is less compassionate. That would be an example of compassion as strength. It also takes a lot of courage to be that leader, um, supporting your people that way. I really liked the insight that you offered earlier about self-compassion in that process as well. So really working through one's own if one is going to take that role of shielding other people's from hurt, really having that process of being able to deal with that internally oneself and having an outlet for that,
Yeah.
really important. Having peers that one can talk to,
Yeah.
coaches that might support that
Absolutely.
way,
Yeah.
having a process of,
Right.
yeah, self-awareness and not just being the angry compassion warrior,
Yeah.
but really going internally as well and finding, yeah, just turning that toxicity, the poison into nectar, so to
Yes.
speak, the alchemy.
Yes. And that's what we're referring to Kristen Neff and her book Fierce Self-Compassion. I heard an interview with a former coach of the women's team at Manchester United.
Uh-huh.
And she said that in terms of building a compassionate environment for her team and for the club, she was doing lots of work, including toxin handling and buffering, like you've talked about, policy setting and culture setting, like we've talked about. But also, there was a point at which she was not enabled by the higher level leaders of the club to dedicate the resources in the way that she knew her players needed.
Mhm.
So that was the moment at which she needed to leave the organization in protest as
Right,
a fierce self-compassion and compassion change maker, right?
right.
Like that was a using her discernment and wisdom, a place where she needed to take a courageous stand. And so
Yeah,
this, as we were talking about with compassion and power, this begins to look like a quite complex array of things happening under the term compassion.
absolutely. And yeah, there's so much to explore. There's so much that's unfolding. One area that we haven't had a chance to speak about yet, with our quickly diminishing time, and that is compassion as a response to
Yes.
suffering as
Yes.
well.
Do you want to take 60 seconds and tell us about pre-spronts rather than waiting for suffering and responding to it? Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah. So when often we talk about compassion as a response to suffering, and that's problematic because suffering is both um, that which is manifest, but then there's also suffering that we can anticipate as well during mergers and acquisitions, during change within the organization. But there's also suffering that can happen within the organization in terms of bullying and so on and so forth. So organizations can anticipate this. And so rather than thinking, if we broaden our thinking about compassion, not only as responding to suffering, but also anticipating suffering, anticipating the pain that will inevitably be there from processes that are unfolding and that it will likely cause suffering, and then to be a compassionate leader by responding to
Mm,
that suffering, then
yeah.
we really broaden our thinking around what compassion entails and involves as well.
Ace, obviously, we could talk about organizational compassion for a long time because we've already exhausted our hour together, but it was delightful to be in this conversation with you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for writing this textbook on organizational compassion. I hope many, many, many people in the world are using it to study and to learn more about this important topic. And I hope you'll come back and talk with us again.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, an honor, a delight. I always enjoy talking with you and having this opportunity to discuss with an audience or with community as well has been just wonderful. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all. Go out and make some compassionate change.